Great. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Today, I will be presenting about the Kus-kus-sum project. So I'll be giving you the updates for the year, also giving you a little bit of an opportunity to ask any questions and have a bit of a dialogue about the project and where we're at in the process. So I'll be basically going through the works that are happening this year, how the project is going, and give you an overall update. So if you do have any questions, I would encourage you to unmute yourself and ask them. Since I'm moderating solo today, it's a little bit easier if you just unmute yourself and ask your question. I'll keep an eye on the chat, but it's harder for me to do that while I'm seeing my screen share here. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask them. It's great to have a bit of a dialogue today about the project. You can also raise your hand if that's a better way. So as you folks probably know by now, there's a little bar at the bottom and you can press one of the reactions, one of which is raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, I'll be able to see that you have a question. And at that point, you can unmute yourself or type what you want into the chat. So with that, thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Caitlin Percholsky, and I'm the Executive Director of Project Watershed. Tonight, I'll be presenting on the Kus-kus-sum project, which is a partnership project between three partners, the City of Courtenay, the Comox First Nation, and of course, us, Project Watershed. So Kus-kus-sum was primarily a tidally influenced forested riparian habitat before its development in 1959 as a sawmill. I would like to remind everyone that this project and these lands are the traditional and unceded territory of the Comox First Nation, who were the traditional stewards of this landscape, and of course of this parcel of land specifically before its development as a sawmill. The sawmill was developed early in the 1950s or 1949 is often the date I see. You can see an iteration of the sawmill, a very early iteration of the sawmill here. This was taken from across the river. So you can see the sawmill in the background here, and it's right at river level. You can see some of the older infrastructure there, and it's right at river level. So you can imagine the risk for flooding was high. This is kind of the end of its life cycle here. So this is kind of peak development for the sawmill. You can see the large processing buildings up here in the north. You can see the log storage here around the center, the water lots along the front here where they would store logs and booms. And then there was a little office building here as well. And then the shipping and sorting facility here. So this would have been early 1990s when it was in peak production. As you folks, I'm sure know, the sawmill shut down in the early 2000s in 2004, and then underwent a remediation process. So when Project Watershed purchased the land in 2021, this is what the landscape looked like. Between the time of this photo and this photo, the mill was shut down in 2004, and then from 2006 until 2008, the lands underwent an extensive remediation. The remediation was then reported out on, and then in 2011, the site was offered a certificate of compliance from the province and then was put up for sale. At this point, the lot sat very much like this for an extended period of time until 2017, when Project Watershed, in partnership with the Comox First Nation and the City of Courtenay, entered into an agreement with Interfor, who was the owner of the landscape at this time, to purchase the land, to hold the land until we were able to raise the required funds for purchase. So from the period of 2017 to 2020, we did extensive fundraising to get to that $3.2 million goal. We eventually reached that in late 2020 and then entered into a Bear Trust agreement with the other two partners to purchase and transfer the land in early 2021. This is just a little reminder here of the end goal. So this is actually just downriver at the Hollyhock Flats Conservation Area. So from this photo, you're on the right bank. of the Courtney River, looking towards the left bank, which is Hollyhock Flats Conservation Area, which has been a conservation area since the 1970s. So the overarching goals of the Kus-kus-sum project are to restore the ecological values of the site, to reconnect the site to the floodplain and the Courtney River through the removal of the steel piling wall. It is also a process of reconciliation and rematriation of landscapes, which means that the landscape after its successful restoration will be rematriated or returned to the Comox First Nation. The project also represents significant climate change adaptation and mitigation values. So this includes flood control, storm surge buffering. It also includes things like carbon sequestration. So there are a lot of different values that are embodied in the site. And of course, the hope is also that this project will offer community resilience in this specific section of the region. So when we were developing the plan for Kus-kus-sum, we did some two-dimensional hydraulic modeling to understand what the flood capacity would be and how the site would react in a couple of different scenarios. So shown here is a high winter flow event. So this is the discharge of the Courtney River down here in the left. This is the tide height at the Comox Harbor. And then this is basically what the site looked like before, without the restoration plan. So just as it was in 2021. And then this is how the site will react in those flood conditions once it's restored. So you can see deep water is shown in yellow and red, and less deep water, so more shallow water, is shown here in light blue. So there's deep water pool environments throughout the site. There's some tidal channels shown here. There's a tidal marsh island, and then the site actually ends here and continues here. So this shows the upland area here. So this is the one of the restoration designs. So you can see here some of the specifics. So once again, shown here is the high water mark. This is that tidal marsh island. This is the deep water pool, which will be significant salmonid habitat, and then the channels, which water will flow through throughout the day. So once it's restored, it will have a suite of different vegetation throughout the site. So in the upland area that we spoke about, you can see some different species, some large growing species, specifically conifers, things like Sitka spruce. We also have some firs in there. We also have things like alder, cottonwood, and some shrubby species like high bush cranberry. We also have red flowering currant, some dogwood, twinberry, hawthorn, rose, and salmonberry as well. Once you get into these kind of gradient areas, that's when you have things like the hardhack and the sweetgale. You also start to get things like the willows as well. And then as you get down into these lower areas, that's when you get into the high, mid, and low tidal marsh communities. So at the top here, you'll see things like I mentioned, tufted hairgrass, springbok clover, meadow barley, sweet-scented bedstraw, and then as you get lower, that's when you start to see those significant Lingby sedge communities. These are really important for salmonid habitat. They offer great habitat for rearing and foraging outmigrating juveniles because they get full of bugs and then the bugs fall off. So that's a phenomenon known as bug drop, and essentially all those bugs get eaten by the juvenile salmonids. And then as you get into the lowest areas closest to the river, that's when you start to see things like the glaucs and triglocken species as well. And currently in the north section of the site, you can see examples of each of these different communities. They're still small because they were just planted last year, but essentially you can start to really see these vegetative communities progressing, which is really exciting. So the timeline of the project, The timeline of the project is as follows. In 2016, the partnership team was formed. In 2017, we entered into that agreement with Interfor to purchase the site, and that's when we really launched our fundraising regime. in 2020, 2021. We purchased the site. And then from there, we were able to initiate restoration. So the first step was really removing those hard surfaces, getting the concrete and asphalt removed off the surface, broken up, and then removed from the site. And then in 2022, 2023, that's when we started the recontouring and revegetation. And then that's what we are continuing into this year as well. So nothing crazy new from what you've already seen. If you are a local and you live nearby, the works will be very similar to last year, but we'll just be moving our way from the north of the site to the south. So you'll see some considerable progress this year. And then the very, very last step of the restoration will be the removal of the steel piling wall. Currently, that's slated for the winter of 2024, 2025, but that will really depend on how far we get in the restoration this year. So here's a photo of the first step. This was the unpaving. So this is breaking up that concrete with a special bit on the excavator. And from there, we were able to dig down with the bucket, break up the concrete and pull out the all the rebar and steel mesh that was throughout. So this is a photo of that here. It's looking pretty good and pretty exciting. Here is a wonderful pile of concrete and another wonderful pile of asphalt. All the asphalt was actually recycled. It gets melted down and then mixed with gravel and turned into a product used for maintaining roads called wrap. And then this here, this is concrete, and it was actually crushed down into smaller pieces, which I will show you later. And all of that was actually recycled and repurposed around the valley. This is an example here of the metal recycling. So hundreds of bins of metal were actually recycled off the site, and all of these were pulled out from within the concrete matrix. Here is just a picture of the machinery that we mobilized to site to crush up the concrete. It was crushed into 3-inch minus, which is a reusable, functional material that's often used for fill or road base. Here's another photo of that, just loading up all the trucks, moving off site. Of course, there were some unknowns that we ran into throughout the restoration. For example, we found a 200-meter concrete wall just underneath the surface along the steel piling wall. So we had to remove that. That was a very technical piece of work because this excavator here, you weren't able to get water into this bit because it would basically get sucked up into the machinery and ruin it. So we had to be very careful, pumping a lot. You can see some pumps down here, and just being really selective with how we used the machinery. So then last year we were able to enter into the recontouring phase. So once we had essentially popped the top on the site, removed the all the concrete and asphalt and repurposed it around the valley, that's when we were able to start the earthworks, which consist of basically getting the site back down to a natural grade, so back down to natural elevations because it was filled. So getting back down to those natural grades, and then from there, bringing in some topsoil and amendment. And then from there, that's when we're able to plant. So these were some of the planting efforts. You can see here, sweet little Doug fir, I think. I am planting some salmonberry. This was a part of the first planting effort that was done in spring 2022. This is a part of the second planting effort that was carried out last October. So this year you can see some of those great Lingby sedge benches. So most of the plants that you can visibly see here are the Lingby sedge. And this is actually a group of 40 Ocean Bridge participants. So that's a program based out of Oceanwise in the Lower Mainland. And they are planting all of these plants for us, which was great. So we were able to plant about 12,000 square meters of the site last year, which is really exciting. And we'll be hoping to do that, if not more, this year as well. Here's a photo of after the planting with a couple of remaining pieces. So this is from the upland area looking down to those tidal marsh benches. Last year, we had to overwinter the site. So that means installing some structures at the south end to make sure that water it doesn't get in for the most part, and then in an extreme flooding event, that the water can actually get out and filter back through the site. that is one of the turbidity and erosion control structures. So we have a lot of these in place. So this is a fence that basically stops the turbid water from leaving the site before it drops out some of its sediment. And that is another structure that performs the same function. It basically floats up and down with the tidal height and filters out the water. So we did have an extensive flooding event. I think it was December 26th, maybe. Here you can see that event here. So this is the Courtney River, this is the steel piling wall, and this is all the water. And this is our field tech, Jeremiah, who has the wonderful job of being one of our site supervisors on this site. So when things like this happen, he's out there to just make sure that everything's going well. So this is basically looking the other direction. So this is looking from the south end up at that flooding event. And then this is just a video of the water coming in over the steel piling wall. So as you can see, the steel piling wall really isn't acting as flood prevention for the site, even when we get those really large flood events. So the interesting thing here is actually the very beginning. Well, the whole thing's a little bit interesting to me, but if you go, let me see if I can just go back here. So if you go to the beginning of this video here, this was a really extreme flooding event. So this was high tide, king tide, storm surge, so water pushing up through the estuary. And then it was also a rain on snow event, which is a pretty significant precip event. And so what you see here is the water coming in over the steel piling wall. But actually you see about a meter and a half worth of resilience in this berm here, so we could still undergo a significant amount more flooding before the berm is overtopped. So the intention of this is actually a really good sign for us because this site has been designed to have sea level rise in mind. So the fact that we're already seeing that meter of sea level rise resilience in the site is a really good signal for us that we've got our elevations correct. And so even in these extreme flood events, we still have integrated resiliency to future climate change scenarios. So the very last phase will be removing the steel piling wall. We'll be working with DFO, Current Environmental, our engineers at Northwest Hydraulics Consultant, and qualified contractors on best removal methods. We're currently considering removing the steel piling wall from a barge in the river with a crane with a vibrating hammer, or a vibrating arm rather, to pull out the sheet piles. Those piles will then probably have to get laid on the land and then removed either via barge or truck. So we are currently in the process of getting the requisite permits for this piece of work. And just as a general overview, for that piece of work, we do have construction environmental management plan measures in place. So that will include sound habituation and reduction. So this can be quite a noisy procedure. It's less noisy than pile driving. It's considerably less noisy than pile driving. But one of the things that you do is you slowly start the machinery and you start in very low volume measures, and that gives any wildlife that's in the area the chance to either move away from the machinery or to habituate it so it's not so overwhelming. There will also be a lot of turbidity and erosion control measures in place as we pull out the steel piling wall, because this will let water into the site in a more uncontrolled way, but it will also allow turbid water potentially to leave the site as well. And then actual removal may stir up a bit of turbidity as well. So there will be curtains around the working site as well as on the land side of the Kus-kus-sum site. So there will be a lot of turbidity and erosion control measures in place because we anticipate that this piece of work will take 4 months, which is why we're looking at the winter window, because that's the time in which there will be the potential to expose the least number of species to the turbidity that this may cause. So that's one of the things that we're working on right now, but we're working closely with DFO on their recommendations for this piece of work. So I'd just like to acknowledge the wisdom and hard work of a group of folks from our partner group. So the Kus-kus-sum partner group is staff and elected officials from each of the 3 partnerships. groups. So the City of Courtenay, the Comox First Nation, and Project Watershed. We provide project updates once a month, we discuss relevant topics, and we plan for the future. This has been a great platform for solutions-based thinking and collaboration, and it's been such a supportive and wonderful group to work with. So I'm very thankful for these group of folks and I look forward to continuing to work. So as we do the regrading and recontouring works on site this year, as well as the replanting, there's a bunch of different measures that we need to have in place to make sure that the restoration work itself doesn't cause any damage to the environment. So we know that our long-term footprint will be overall positive, but we just want to make sure that in the process of restoration that we're not causing any undue damage. So that includes doing ongoing machine maintenance and monitoring. So we keep a close eye on the machinery, make sure there aren't any leaks. And when there are leaks, we have spill kits on site to deploy. And then we're able to do maintenance away from the river for those machineries. Like I said, we have a spill management program in place. We also have turbidity and erosion control structures installed. And we have ongoing water quality monitoring as well. So whenever construction starts, the water quality monitoring starts as well. So we take mostly turbidity, but also pH, temperature, and other measures upstream, on site, and downstream from the site to just make sure that the construction isn't having an impact on the water quality in the area. We've also been doing extensive soils testing. So because of the past of the site, we know that there are the possibilities for the soils to be impacted. So we've done extensive soils testing to understand what the possible impacts to the site are, if there are any problematic soils, and then understanding the extent and the depth at which those soils are occurring so that we can dispose of them in the proper way. This has been a challenging piece of the project for sure, because proper soils disposal has been very, very expensive. So there has been some additional remediation required as we've gone in and done soil testing, and that has been very expensive work. The other piece of the work that helps us control for any potential damages is just timing the work. So if we work in the summer months, there's the less possibility of impacts to the surrounding area. And then we also make sure that we time things like the steel piling wall removal in the months that they have the least impact to the surrounding environment. And then, of course, we have dust suppression, which was particularly important in the concrete removal and crushing times, but also continues to be important as we move through the earthworks, as it gets awfully dry on site, especially during those hot summer months. So we have a water truck that does runs the site once a day or twice a day, depending on how hot it is. And then we also have water access on site, so we can hose down the site as well. So the key works in 2023, we started off the year by doing a maintenance of the turbidity and erosion control structures at the south end of the site. That was required because of the extensive flooding that happened at the end of December. So we mobilized again in January to make sure that all of the structures that hold the water in and stop any additional erosion and turbid water from leaving the site, that those were in they were well maintained. So we went in early January to maintain those structures, just in case there was another king tide event. So we anticipated that there might be another flooding event. We did maintain the structures, but there was no additional flooding. So now the structures are just in really good repair, which is great. So this year, we'll be continuing the regrading of the site. So we'll be starting from basically where we leave off planting. So you can kind of see that on the site now, but basically we'll be starting from the north end, moving south. We'll try to basically go as far as we can with the amount of funding that we have in place. Once we've recontoured the soil, that's when we can go in and we can bring in top soil and compost, and then we'll also mulch, and then we'll start to plant native species. We'll be doing ongoing soils testing and, of course, sorting those soils and then determining where they can go for off-site removal. So some of the soils on the site are clean and they can go to any old site for removal. Some of the soils on site need to be moved to a registered facility. So we have identified those facilities and we have good working relationships with them so that we can move those soils off-site. As we go through the construction, there will be ongoing ecological and environmental monitoring, and also archaeological monitoring. So we know that the site could have some archaeological sensitivities. So we have the KFN guardians on site throughout construction to just make sure that we're not encountering any of those sediments. And if we do encounter any sort of cultural sediments, then we stop work, and then we figure out a plan. And we have a plan in place, sorry, for what to do in those cases. Once we have the site back to final grade, that's when we can come in with the native species. So we'll be doing an extensive planting effort in October. So if you're interested in coming out and helping with the planting, you'll have lots of opportunities come October to do that. In the summertime, we'll also have to install a little bit of riprap at the north and south ends. So there is important infrastructure at both the south and north ends of the site. So we're going to be installing a little bit of riprap to basically stop the new site design from having any impacts on surrounding infrastructure. And then we'll also be planning and investigating methods for the steel piling wall removal. That has already started, and things are looking good so far, which is great. And then we'll also be doing continued collaboration on the final site for planning access, as well as restoring the site to the Comox First Nation. So far, we have raised 75% of the restoration total. So that is about $3.5 million that we've raised, really, which is really exciting, but we still have an additional 1 to 1.5 million that's required for the final restoration goals to be met. So this is 84% of the project total. We're almost there, but we're not quite. So any funding opportunities that you may know of, please pass them my way. We're very, very keen to see this project happen. And right now there is a large funding deficit. Great. Maybe I will take this opportunity to answer any questions that folks may have. I do see one in the chat here that maybe we'll start off with. Which is how the project may reduce the risk of flooding to the city of Courtenay. So we have done a lot of hydraulic modeling to understand how our site will react in a flooding scenario, but we haven't projected what that will look like for the wider surrounding area. But we do know that our site will actually be holding more water in a flood scenario than there would be than would happen previously. So there may actually be a reduction of flooding in across the bank at Old House or at Locals, so in that parking lot that often floods. And we do know that the back berm will increase the resiliency of the adjacent Comox Road because it actually increases the elevation of the back of the site beyond what was there previously. So we'll be able to have flood protection of the road back there. Great. And I see that Catherine has a question in the chat here. I'm going to maybe just stop sharing so I can see everything a little bit easier. Catherine had a question around what rematriation will look like. So rematriation is a term used to describe returning landscapes to their traditional stewards. So in this case, to the Comox First Nation. So essentially, Project Watershed owns the property currently in trust for the Comox First Nation and the city of Courtenay. So what will happen is that Project Watershed and the city of Courtenay, and of course our legal teams, will advise on the process by which the land is transferred fully to Comox First Nation for ownership. One of the things that we do anticipate is that it may be included in the Comox First Nations treaty process. We don't have a lot of details of exactly what the final land ownership will look like, but we do know that the site will be fully restored and that there will be a form of conservation covenant on the landscape so that we can ensure that the land is conserved in perpetuity. Does that answer your question, Catherine? Perfect, awesome. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, well, um, I will put my email in the chat here. So if folks do have questions after the webinar today, you're more than welcome to send me an email, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. So, with that, thank you so much for joining us. Construction started today at Kus-kus-sum, as I'm sure folks saw. So you'll see two rock trucks, two big excavators there, and a whole bunch of people all working very hard to restore the landscape. So if you have any questions at all, definitely reach out to me. You can also give us a call at the Project Watershed office. We're also open these days from Monday to Thursday from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. So if you're interested in coming by the office and talking to us about how you can engage with our work or just generally getting an update, please feel free to drop by and say hello. And thank you so much for joining us tonight, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your night.